Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is September 7th, 2017. As everyone in the world knows, North Korea fired a rocket over Japanese territory just 1 week ago, and this development has startled not only the U.S. government and the Japanese government, but the residents of Japan as well. I'd like to talk about that issue. Michael Cucek, thank you very much for joining me again.
It's great to be back.
This thing is really beginning to morph, isn't it?
Well, it's a snowballing effect, whether that's simply because the DPRK is feeling more confident in its program and just accelerating it.
Fire and fury.
Or, that's right, is if there is some kind of tennis match going on between the tweets and the comments of President Donald Trump and responses from the North Korean side.
Right.
Of course, Trump may be simply only facilitating what is truly the North Koreans' goals, which are to have an ability to threaten the United States in such a way that the United States never tries to invade North Korea. But it puts a spotlight on Donald Trump.
Yeah,
and
put up or shut up.
I mean, to shut up,
right.
And one wonders what his seemingly most common world leader as a conversation, as a conversation partner, which seems to be Mr. Abe, what Mr. Abe is saying in these many phone calls. That
45 minutes the last time.
Long phone calls that he's been having with President Trump. This is an extremely unusual situation. I cannot think of a time when the Japanese Prime Minister was the major interlocutor for the U.S. president, and that the rest of the world is on the sidelines. Of course, the president has been speaking to the president of South Korea, but there is this relationship that Mr. Abe, of course, crafted starting in the fall of last year, which now suddenly seems to be vital not just for Japan's trade interests or Japan's security interests, but for the security interests of the world.
Right. Well, isn't Abe now speaking with President Putin on just this issue in Vladivostok?
I mean, the Vladivostok talk was about economic development of the Far Eastern region of Russia. That's what the framework is. And that was the intent as a part of this process that the Abe administration, through Meti Minister Seko, to engage Russia toward talking about an eventual peace treaty in that conflict, which is World War II, which is not over.
But in the back room, can you cut off the oil?
But it's going to be in the front room, because the Russians and the Chinese have been in the driver's seat in that they have actual political relations and trade relations. Of course, the Chinese trade relation is massive as compared to anyone else's with the DPRK, and their little Frankenstein monster has gotten out of control.
Right.
Now, the Russian side has been consistently underestimating the distances that the missiles have been flying, and again, was talking about the most recent test that went over Japan as being a missile that was significantly smaller than could make the trip. All kinds of very strange, just denials of reality. And that is going to be playing a part in that conversation. Why have you seemingly not been able to do the telemetry? Why have you not been able to see these things on your radars, which are supposedly protecting your country from missile attack? You should be able to have a true story, but your story is different from everybody else's. That's one hurdle that Abe has to get over with Putin. But then the next one is, how do these two different tracks go? We want you to push hard on the DPRK, and we want to have good relations. Don't you see that's a package?
Right.
And I don't know if that's going to get across to Putin.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about, so what? Why can't they fire these missiles? I mean, France did it, the United States did it, and then you guys formed a club, and then you disallowed everybody else from doing it. What's wrong with us, the North Koreans, developing this kind of technology, this capacity? You guys did it, and you just made a club so that nobody else can do it, and we're going to go forward, even though it violates international law that you guys made for yourselves. we can do it too.
Well, in this case, the problem for the DPRK is that it is a member of the United Nations, and the United Nations Security Council has numerous resolutions that forbid the DPRK to undertake these actions.
And they've signed agreement after agreement that we're not going to do it. Send us the generators. Send us the heavy water. We're not going to do it.
Now, to talk about the DPRK and reneging on contracts is you'll be talking all day. But nevertheless, the UN Security Council, which is the institution that brings together the Chinese, the Russians, the French, the Americans, and also the rest of the world community in the non-permanent seats, has spoken on this repeatedly. Mm-hmm. And so that's the big deal. However, the issue really is technical. The overflight was, the estimated altitude as it passed over Hokkaido was at 550 kilometers, which is basically the limit of what an Aegis SM-3 can knock out. So that
they didn't even try.
They didn't even try,
right.
Because the question is why? I just started the sentence because, and there are all kinds of answers that have come out. One is that technically the chances of missing were extreme, and if you miss on the first time you try, that's a huge propaganda loss, and indicates that one could try again. Others is that you don't want to start a conflict over something that, actual sovereignty does not extend into space that far. Mm-hmm. So what message are you trying to send? Whatever happened, there were Japanese assets that have anti-missile capabilities that did just watch it. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the warning system, the J-alert system.
We got one here in Tokyo, 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, and it was with the wah-wah sirens coming out of your phone, or there were sirens that were playing through most of northern Japan, particularly in Hokkaido, as this missile went over. And there was a lot of sarcastic commentary, both on Twitter and on Facebook. Oh, it's told me to seek shelter. Where can I seek shelter? Right. What is this? That there was.
The reaction from the Japanese population basically overall was yawn.
Well, it's basically like, where are we going to go?
Right.
And of course, the news agencies could find some people. I'm so terrified. Mm-hmm. This is so scary.
Well, I don't think
which they then put up on broadcast as some kind of representative of the Japanese people. But in large part, it was shrug your shoulders, and the others were there's nothing we can do anyway.
Well, the South Koreans too. They're not hunkering down into bomb shelters whenever they launch one of these missiles, thinking that there might be a retaliatory strike or some sort of action taken by the United States, which would then trigger a North Korea reaction. Everybody's going on business as usual.
And it was really quite funny that many corporations and many institutions sent out emails to their employees.
Please come to work as usual.
Yeah, please come to work at the usual time using your usual route. There has been we have heard reports that North Korea has tested a missile. Please come to work.
Okay. The other thing about this, Michael, though, before we get too far off of it, the missile landed in territory that was closer to Russia than it was to Japan, and you didn't hear anything from the Russians.
Well, the overflight is basically a distance measure, and one of the things that the DPRK did was talk about targeting Guam, the island of Guam, which, in addition to being a U.S. territory, is also chock-a-block with tourists from all of East Asia. Lots of Japanese there. A lot of the tourist infrastructure is either paid for by Japanese corporations, or the restaurants are Japanese restaurants. The bus system is a Japanese system.
Right.
But there are also South Koreans there. Increasingly, there are Russians who go there for warm weather vacations. It's not a great place to threaten. Mm-hmm. It's also, of course, a huge United States military base, which is why the DPRK went after
It's
it.
going to sink pretty soon, you know.
Yeah, but yeah, that's an in-joke for those of us who know about the U.S. congressional testimony on Guam. But that's where the strategic bombers are placed. And there are no strategic bombers in Japan. Mm-hmm. If there is going to be some kind of bombing that takes place, the planes will take off from Andersen Air Force Base there in Guam and make a slow route all the way up and then make their way back. So it makes sense for the DPRK to make that threat. But the United States' response was hysterical to that threat, and the way to send a message was simply, okay, we're not going to send it into the direction of Guam, we'll send it in another direction, but in exactly the same distance.
Sure, it was. I mean, the trajectory had been changed.
So right. It was as if a clock hand had been shifted.
But the other thing, if you look at the trajectory, it covered the least amount of possible Japanese land mass. So this is very calculated. It's not going to go away. I don't think whatever response the United States or the Japanese or the Koreans or the Chinese come up with, he is on a mission, and he is going to use this as a leverage to get whatever concessions he can.
The question is what is Japan supposed to do?
Well, increase their military budget.
Yeah, increase the military budget in actual terms, but since the whole budget is going to be larger, and the percentage of that's eaten up by, let's say, Social Security is actually growing more than the defense budget. It's not, relatively speaking, it's not a big deal.
Right. So people aren't listening to what the foreign minister, the finance minister said about hurry up and die.
Yeah. Well, in this case, the military budget is going to grow by 2.4%. Social Security is going to grow by 2.5%, and that 2.5% growth is on 1/3 of the budget. Defense eats up 5% of the budget, 1/20th of the budget. It's a really small fraction, and it's growing by 2.4.
2.5 is big, though.
Yeah, it's 2.4, 2.5 it's big historically, and throughout the Abe tenure, it has gone up very significantly every year. But it's nowhere near. It's 1% of GDP. It's nowhere near where it needs to be to NATO standards. Much less for a country that's trying to defend itself.
Right.
And even if you did spend the money, what would you spend it on? Well, certainly buying the world's most expensive aircraft, the F-35, is a good start. And Japan is acquiring F-35s and will have, when it gets them, for the first time, preemptive attack capabilities.
Okay, that's preemptive. It has nothing to do with missile defense.
But it does, in that in that you would hit the missiles or whatever targets before they're fired. That's because.
Oh, okay, right. But that's an act of war.
That's an act of war, but there's nothing. Normally one would think that Article 9 forbids that, but the Cabinet Legislative Bureau, back in the 1950s, when it was considering these basic issues of security, said that under certain circumstances, an attack immediately preceding what appears to be an attack on the other side can be justified as self-defense and not an act of war. It's a very funky kind of interpretation that is on really shaky grounds with a lot of people. But nevertheless, that capacity has never been there, so it's been a theoretical point until now.
Right.
With an F-35 as a stealth fighter, you go in unannounced with some kind of weapon system, which you will deliver and then go out without being detected.
And there goes South Korea.
That's as a response, yes, but that's the preemptive capacity that Japan has never had before.
Yeah.
So they're going to be going forward with that spending. They're going to get some kind of standoff weapon, but beyond that, this question of will Japan go nuclear in response to North Korea's going nuclear? No.
Probably don't need to. They've got the United States to do that for them.
But the United States, of course, is now less reliable under the Trump presidency. It's now a country that does not pursue
I don't
action.
think so.
But the stance of the United States is first ambiguous because one doesn't know what President Trump is thinking at any one time.
Which is one of his signature moves.
Yeah,
Right.
being unpredictable, which is terrible for allies because they want you to be absolutely
That's right.
predictable. Beyond that, the United States nuclear stance is unclear, and of course there are persons who argue that one of the goals of the DPRK is to break apart the certainty of the alliances by saying that, okay, because you're allied to our enemies, Japan, we're targeting you in the United States. So, don't, end this relationship with the Japanese, and maybe we'll discuss only targeting Japanese targets.
Right.
Which, of course, makes no sense because you would have to completely remove all U.S. service members and all U.S. and their dependents out of Japan before there would be some kind of deal there,
Right.
which is not going to happen.
Yeah. The smart move to me seems to be, rather than aiming a missile, either a nuclear or maybe an EMP, is probably more effective to Japan because it's closer. You got 6 minutes of warning, and you probably send the same signal rather than trying to hit the United States, which probably takes 12 or 15 minutes. Plenty of warning there.
I don't even want to go game these things out. The questions right now are what are the proximate things that Japan can do.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, talking to the South Koreans a lot is the first line of business because the usual pathway of just talking to the United States and relying on that long-term alliance relationship is clearly insufficient.
Right. Right.
So Mr. Abe has to do that. There have been discussions about, because there is a relationship with trust between Abe and President Trump, that Abe could get away with sending a personal envoy to Pyongyang.
Right.
And the scandal mags are all talking about Koizumi Junichiro as being that guy. Now, that would first seem, crazy because, he likes being retired. He doesn't want to have to do anything. He has an easygoing life, doesn't get involved in politics, doesn't even help his own son get reelected. Why would he want to jump back into the fire? But then one also has to consider that he would be ideal. Yeah. He's got the gravitas. He's a former prime minister. He's been there before. And for Kim Jong-un, you met my dad back then.
Dennis Rodman is busy otherwise.
And that kind of relationship often seems to work, have some kind of magic with North Koreans. And the North Koreans are right now on a merry-go-round along with everybody else in the world. And maybe they want to get off. And the only way they can get off is if they have someone of extremely high stature go and pretend to pay tribute to this wonderful young man.
Maybe that's what he wants. I don't know. But there are two other issues that have come up, and this issue is going a little bit long. The possibility of an EMP, and the other issue is the hydrogen bomb explosion that they experienced, 4 days ago?
Well, on Sunday, they seemingly did a full thermonuclear test, yes, with yield somewhere between 120 and 140 kilotons, which is a factor of 10 higher than anything that they've achieved previously. All kinds of technical achievements there that you could go on. The EMP story is always something that's brought up. The thing is about EMP is that it just fries all your stuff as well as everybody else's, so it's not really a great idea. And also, it empowers groups to discuss nuclear weapons as something that would be used given a battlefield use because they would be serving as a knockout blow. It's best not to go there. I don't want to.
No, but because we haven't figured out why North Korea is doing this. To get leverage, obviously, somehow, but they are on a roll, and it seems to me that no matter what concessions are given to them, history has shown us, that they're not going to stop. They're on a path to military development.
Well, they've looked at what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, what happened to Saddam Hussein, and what's happening to the Ukrainians in their struggles with the Russians.
Venezuela.
Let me
It's a different issue, but it's...
No, it's a completely different issue. But they've looked at those three countries, and they gave up their nuclear weapons or their nuclear weapons programs, and they either were killed, or the leaders were killed, or in the case of Ukraine, Russia can terrorize them. That's a very good. Those are very good examples of why you should not.
Right.
If you have a nuclear capability, why you should hang on to it and develop it. You can't argue with that. The only thing that you can say is, sure, you can have your nuclear deterrent, but nothing else good will happen to you. That's the message everyone wants China to send.
Right.
To the DPRK, but the Chinese, for their own reasons, have found it very difficult to pull themselves completely out of a country which they saved back in 1950. Their troops saved that country, and China shed blood in making that country continue onward when it was on the brink of being overwhelmed by Allied forces. They're having a hard time walking away and stopping their companies doing trade. And if they're not in on it, nobody's in on it.
North Korea firing missiles over Japan, stirring the pot geopolitically. Please stay tuned to this issue because this story's not over yet.